The honourable member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the building and construction industry, so-called Improving Productivity Amendment Bill 2017. This legislation is anti-union, anti-democratic and anti-market. It's bad legislation for many reasons, Deputy Speaker. I'll point that out through the prism of a couple of things. Firstly, the construction industry is a dangerous industry. Many people die or are injured in that industry, unlike many other jobs. And as the member for Parramatta mentioned in her speech, around 25% of companies involved in the construction industry, particularly smaller ones, end up going insolvent, and that means workers miss out on being paid and small businesses miss out on getting paid and go to the wall. And they end up owing millions and millions and millions in wages and superannuation. And the third point is that this, despite all said by those opposite, this legislation is talking about a civil enforcement regime, not a criminal enforcement regime. They're dressing it up as if it's a criminal process, but that is not the case. That was never the intent of this legislation. So I point that out. It is, however, remarkable that we are debating this amendment bill in the second sitting week of 2017. The Building and Construction Industry Improving Productivity Bill 2013 only passed the parliament in the final sitting week of 2016. The ink's barely dry on that piece of legislation, but already this hopeless Turnbull government is trying to patch up problems with their own legislation, the legislation that they in fact took almost 3 years to get passed through this parliament. And you would think that when it was finally passed, it would have been a well-considered and fit for its purpose bill. But now we have the Turnbull government trying to trash its own laws just weeks after enacting them. So what's this all about? Well, it's all about existing negotiated and agreed legal enterprise bargaining agreements that are not compliant with the new code. Companies with these settled non-compliant agreements are not able to submit expressions of interest and tenders for Commonwealth work. And they are significant companies, big players in the Australian construction industry. The legislation that passed last year allowed for companies whose current agreements are not code compliant to still be able to submit expressions of interest and tenders up until November 2018. This bill attempts to wind back that exemption to September this year, just 7 months away. So this will put these hard-working companies and their hard-working employees in the difficult position of either not tendering for Commonwealth building work and missing out on work at a time when construction is a little bit flat, or having to renegotiate their complicated agreements very, very quickly. This is a complete botch-up by the Turnbull government. They don't even know how many of these agreements will be affected, and it has been reported that there may be up to 3,000 of these agreements, Deputy Speaker. 3,000 agreements that were negotiated in good faith. The code has been rejected time and time again by Parliament and was not law at the time these legal agreements were made, negotiated in the marketplace. I remember when the Liberal Party used to believe in markets. So this retrospective legislation, you could say, is more Turnbull government chaos in the extreme. When the ABCC Bill passed last year, although Labor did not support the bill and still does not agree with the legislation or the need for it, we believed, as did the industry, including employers, that once passed, the building industry could go about its business at least knowing what the law was. When you're talking big projects, you need certainty. So, welcome to the Turnbull government where the goalposts shift as the poles sink. So to put this all in perspective, we need to cast our minds back to early last year when the Prime Minister's popularity was well and truly beginning to slide. The honeymoon was well and truly over. And he thought it was a good idea to call a double dissolution election. We then had the extraordinary act of the proroguing of Parliament. Do you remember that, Deputy Speaker? Where the Prime Minister Turnbull advised the Governor-General to call a double dissolution election, saying that the ABC Bill was, and I quote from his letter to the Governor-General, an important element of the government's economic plan for jobs and growth. There's that term, jobs and growth. You haven't heard that for a while, Deputy Speaker. Jobs and growth. It went missing after July the 2nd. But during the 8 long weeks of the election campaign, there was hardly a murmur about this so-called important piece of legislation that the Prime Minister told us was one of the 2 main reasons he called a double dissolution election. And hasn't worked out well, that double dissolution election. Great to have One Nation and the Liberal Party getting into bed together in Western Australia. 4 One Nation senators, or 3.5, whatever it is, when Western Australia sorts out its mess. We've got 4 One Nation senators, the party that John Howard rejected, now getting into bed with the Liberal Party. We've had a Liberal Prime Minister not able to say boo about it. Disgraceful. But anyway, this legislation was introduced to the House by the government in order to thrust back on Australians the draconian Building and Construction Commission. The legislation finally passed, albeit heavily amended and compromised in the last sitting week of 2016. The ABCC was back in business. The ABCC was originally introduced in 2005. Labor opposed its introduction then and opposed it again last year. Originally implemented by the Howard government, the ABCC was said to be a response to the recommendations of the $60 million Coal Royal Commission. The Coal Commission was established by the Howard government to investigate the building and construction industry, supposedly a, and I quote, hotbed of intimidation, lawlessness, thuggery and violence at the time. Curiously, Deputy Speaker, curiously, not one criminal prosecution, not even a finding of guilt resulted from that entire Royal Commission. As a point of difference, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse has made almost 1,900 referral to authorities so far. That's a fair dinkum, Royal Commission. Let us revisit the period after the ABCC was introduced in 2005. Building industry fatalities jumped 95% between 2006 and 2008. In 2007, 51 workers were killed on construction sites, the highest number in 10 years. During the time the ABCC was in operation, cases were brought against the CFMEU and other unions, resulting in over $5 million in fines and millions more in court costs. That may be good for lawyers, but not the building industry. The ABCC was condemned 8 times by the International Labour Organisation for bias and for breaching conventions that Australia has signed. They were found to have unlawfully interviewed 203 people. When the Labor governments removed the majority of the ABCC's powers and implemented the Fair Work Australia model, we actually saw industrial disputes go down. We saw fatalities go down and, most importantly for the economists out there, productivity increased. The government's argument that the ABCC will increase productivity is actually not borne out by their own data, by their own facts. According to the ABS, construction industry productivity increased more in the 7 years before the introduction of the ABCC than it did in the 7 years the ABCC existed. And productivity has been higher every year since the abolition of the ABCC in 2012. Labor always will abhor corruption and criminal activity in any industry, including the building and construction industry, and we will always fight for doing the right thing with union members' money and not just when it's politically expedient to do so. I particularly hate any union official that misuses union membership fees. I think they are grubs, and I will always fight hard against that. However, this is not about that. The ABCC is not designed to deal with breaches of the criminal law or corruption of any kind. It was set up by the Howard government to enforce civil laws and industrial relations legislation. It is not a tough cop on the beat, as they keep saying, despite their LNP protestations. It's actually, as I said at the start, a civil jurisdiction. During the period the ABCC was in place, there were 330 deaths on construction sites. The investigation set in motion by the ABCC into those deaths, well, it's not hard, zero. Not one investigation was thought warranted out of 330 deaths of ordinary Australians going about their jobs in the construction industry, hard-working Australians who went to their jobs and never came home. So the ABCC was reinstated by the Turnbull government late last year, and already this hapless government are scrambling to make changes to their piece of legislation that they trumpeted. There has been zero consultation with anybody about these amendments, not the employers, the hard-working construction companies, not the unions, not the hard-working employees, no one. The government has no way of knowing how the industry will be impacted by these changes. This is not good government, this is chaos. For example, existing clauses in enterprise agreements that will not continue under the code. What we know is that some clauses in the current agreements won't continue, such as support places for apprentices on building sites by mandating a ratio of apprentices to tradespeople, investing in the future. How about providing mandatory consultation before using temporary overseas workers? How about providing nationally accredited asbestos awareness training for workers? And I'll touch on that a little bit later. Or how about requiring employers to buy Australian-made protective clothing instead of inferior imported ones for their workers? A little bit of economic nationalism. Where redundancies are contemplated, local workers will have priority over temporary foreign workers. Again, a little bit of economic nationalism. Employees being provided with awareness training to recognise potentially suicide behaviour and basic skills to help keep employees safe. And I note that because this is an industry where apprentices in the construction industry are 2.5 times more likely to suicide than young people their own age. These clauses currently exist in some enterprise agreements, but they will not be allowed under the Code. These are clauses that protect our Australian workers and Australian businesses. Now, Deputy Speaker, I've never worked in the building industry, but my 3 brothers currently do. In fact, one of my brothers worked on the construction of Parliament House when the flagpole just over there fell over. He worked for a crane company that had to come and try and fix that up. And my younger brother also works in the building industry. I was actually working on the Twin Towns building site when a crane collapsed and landed right beside him. His back was injured significantly, and the 2 workers standing right alongside him at the cement pour were killed. The kibble nearly hit my brother, just missed him, but the ponder weights actually did significant damage to his back. And obviously, with him being inches away from being killed, he'll forever carry that trauma with him. So seeing the building and construction industry through the prism of my 3 brothers has given me some insight as to how tough this business is, and they've told me many stories about workers and the danger of businesses going belly up. It is a tough industry on workers, physically demanding, and obviously not a job that you can necessarily do through until you're 70. It can be dangerous, and the more costs are cut to improve the bottom line, sadly, the more dangerous it becomes for workers. Whenever safe practices are abandoned, we end up losing lives on work sites. These are the very workers that the government should be working to protect. Sadly, I don't think the Turnbull government does care about hard-working Australian construction workers. It has been left to Labor and the union movement to stand up for these workers. Sadly, with all the ideological union bashing coming from the opposite side, it's easy to forget the great work that unions do for their workers and their employers, for that matter. There is no better evidence when it comes to talking about asbestos, a banned substance since 2003, but sadly building materials containing asbestos are being illegally imported into Australia, especially from China and other parts of the world. I spoke to Andrew Ramsey from the CFMEU about this recently, a very experienced and well-respected workplace health and safety coordinator for the CFMEU, and he told me about getting a phone call on the weekend when they were working at 1 William Street, the new Queensland Government building, where they thought that it might have been asbestos. They then did some investigations, and the piece of material that they'd been cutting with saws to make fit, because they're innovative and industrious, was found to contain 60% asbestos, Deputy Speaker. The old fibro sheets that you might know, they contain about 10 to 15% asbestos. This was a piece in 2016 that contained 60% asbestos, and remember, 1 asbestos fibre is basically enough to kill you. Had been imported through Australia, and but for the CFMEU and the training that the workplace official had, who knows who could have been affected by that asbestos. So we need asbestos awareness training for workers. It's sensible. There are at least 69 job sites from Perth to Brisbane and everywhere between that have had asbestos delivered to them. And sadly, what was the minister's response? Minister Dutton, he actually blamed the CFMEU for driving developers to use illegal and dangerous products on their building sites. That's what the Minister for Safer Borders said in response to this bizarre situation. So that's just one example being told by Andrew Ramsey of what can happen if you don't have it regulated and appropriately credentialed union officials being able to access building sites. This is just one of the many reasons why Labor opposed the reintroduction of the draconian ABCC legislation and why it opposes this retrospective amendment that will only cause chaos in the construction industry. Labor will always protect hard-working Australians. Labor stands up for ordinary families working hard to make ends meet. This bill is just more evidence of a desperate Prime Minister protecting his own job at the expense of Australian workers. These are ordinary, hard-working Australians doing their job in a dangerous industry. They have the right to be protected at their workplace, the right to be safe and to go home at the end of the day.